What do I have to do in order to take a check from an investor? You know, uh, there are some guys who will tell you, just stand there, put your hand out, let the investor put the check in your hand, and then run to the bank. Uh, Maybe that's possible in some places. I certainly wouldn't do it that way. I would never encourage anyone to do it that way. Here's what needs to happen. Number one, you need to have a bank account that's dedicated to whatever the money is for. So you want to be very careful. You don't want to put the money into your own bank account, because if you put it in your own account, that's called commingling. And commingling is a big problem that you don't want to get yourself involved in. So you want to make sure that you separate investor funds from your own funds. Now, let's say you set up a fund and you set up a bank account. Now, a bank account is not easy to open anymore in the United States because of all the problems we had during 9/11 and all the money laundering and all the terrorism, all the issues. The government has set up very strict oversight on banks. So banks have to be very careful about who they take money from, where the money comes from, and so forth. So in order to open a bank account, you have to be able to document that you have an entity, that you have an operating agreement. And you could have a very simple operating agreement. If it's two friends that just start a little business, very simple, no problem at all. But if you've got a passive person giving money to an active person, then you have to be much more careful. The rules totally change when an active person takes money from a passive person. And here's why. The government recognized after 1929, when the stock market crashed, that there are people who have information and there are other people who don't. The active people have all the information. The passive people do not. The active people have all the power. The active people know what's going on. They have all the insights. And the passive people, therefore, are at a significant disadvantage. So the government created these securities rules. They're called securities rules because they give the investor certain protections because they're passive. And because they're passive, they needed to balance the scales a little bit. So the documents that are all put together are all designed to be in compliance with the securities rules, all the disclosures, everything that happens. So I wouldn't take any money from anyone without having all the proper disclosures in place, which is a private placement or the sale of private securities prepared by an attorney, which I am not. So you're going to want to prepare these documents, have them organized by your attorney. You're going to want to have everything put together in a way that the investor gets everything that they need, all the disclosures, all the information. Because the worst thing that could happen is the investor calls you up after there's been a loss. Let's say that there was a truck crashed into the building, knocked it down, you didn't have adequate insurance, and the whole investment was gone. The investor calls you up and said, what happened? Well, we lost all our money because a truck crashed into our building. Well, gee, I can't believe it. I mean, I need my money back. Well, no, I can't give it back to you because now all the money's gone. Well, if your documents don't tell investors that there's a chance they could lose their money and that this could go wrong and that could go wrong. For example, it's possible that we may not have insurance to cover the total loss of the building. It's possible that a meteor could strike the building. It's possible this could happen or this could happen. If you don't have disclosures that let investors know that things could go wrong, they can then come back and they can say, well, you didn't tell me. And here's the worst thing they could say. Well, if you would have told me that, I never would have invested. And so when that happens, you find yourself in a very compromised situation, and the securities rules side with the investors because they're passive. They didn't have any control over what was going on, and therefore you, the promoter, become responsible. So you never want to put yourself in a situation where you haven't properly disclosed. So back to the original question, what do you need to take somebody's money? I wouldn't take their money unless I had a proper disclosure document, a private placement, a proper operating agreement that gave me all the authority and the control that I needed to run the deal in the right way. Now, does it cost money? Yeah, granted, it costs something. It costs more money to do it properly. But does it cost something for it not to go right either? You know, they used to have the Fram oil filter commercial back in the 60s and 70s. You know, either pay me now or pay me later. You will either pay now or you will pay later. You don't get to keep the money over the long term. And if something ever goes wrong, you'll be sorry. So when you're taking money from an investor, be very careful that they know exactly what they're getting into. Deal with people who know what they're getting into, that can afford to take a loss. You would be better to deal with people who are more sophisticated. And when you're dealing with these kinds of people, make sure that they have everything that they need to make an informed and proper decision. And when you do that, then you're going to really experience this is a great business, because it is a great business. Now go out and stake your claim.